Okay, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today for the basics of background screening. We have Rob Brunt here from IntelliProcessing that we've partnered with. He has over 15 years of background check industry experience and brings a level of expertise and a captivating energy to the industry that he has been filled with questions and uncertainties for years. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rob, and he's going to give you all the information you need for just the basics of background screening. So take it away, Rob.
Great. It's a little bit more difficult to have a lot of interaction in this format, but feel free to chime in with questions as we go along through the information. Sometimes it feels like I'm just doing a lot of talking, so feel free to ask any questions as we go. Hopefully everybody can see my screen okay. I just realized that in the background I have a lot of clutter back there now that I'm looking at the video, so sorry about the distractions there, but okay.
Yeah, if you have your questions, if you'll just put them in the chat box, and Rob, I'll kind of let you know when we have a couple you can answer. So everybody just feel free to type in your questions in the chat.
Okay, fantastic. A lot of you may already be doing background checks. Some are probably experienced, know a lot about it. Some may be new to it. So there's probably a wide variety of questions. There is a wide variety of information in this presentation. And so hopefully there's something that's going to be useful here as we hit some different topics. A lot of really cool case studies as well that we'll be talking about. You know, we're just going to talk about some stats, the different types of backgrounds, the difference between national and local screening, which really matters, and then some case studies. So let's see. So as a lot of you know, as technology's changed, so has background checks. And so they're largely automated and relatively easy in comparison to how backgrounds used to work years ago. And really, as employers now, knowledge is power, but getting access to the right information is vital. A lot of people are out there selling pretty crappy information. And at the end of the day, it's the employer that's on the hook and that has the liability. And so there are a lot of unscrupulous background check companies out there, and you just want to be really careful. And that's why you want to make sure whoever you're working with is an expert. Be relying on experts to help you navigate not just an appropriate and a comprehensive search, but all the regulatory, there's a lot of regulatory issues, and they do vary state by state. You know, doing background checks always increases the quality of your talent pool, because surprisingly, there are a lot of companies out there who are not doing background checks. And as a general rule, the people with problems are going to gravitate towards those companies. So with ARCpoint and screening solution, the ARCpoint screening solution is Screening Source. And this is going to give you an opportunity to have your backgrounds and your drug tests on one platform. The nice thing is backgrounds can be added to any record. So if there's clinical records, if there's drug test records, moving forward, you'll be able to add a background check to those. And all packages are simple. They're customized. There's anything that you need can be set up through ARCpoint. So if you just see a handful of packages, don't worry. You know, there's a lot of flexibility here. And the platform automates regulatory compliance, as well as the Fcra compliance, which, as you're going to see, as we cover information, that's getting an increasingly big issue for employers. You know, statistic information, the reality is people are liars. I always joke with my kids that you don't do anything stupid, because everything that you do now is recorded and sold and resold, and potentially something can follow them for a really long time. And I have 2 teenage boys, so obviously I'm constantly talking to them about these issues. 53% of all applications and resumes contain some sort of lie or a falsehood. And 9% of all applications say that when they say that they have a college degree, 9% of those is just an outright lie. Background checks really are the cheapest and most effective pre-employment tool. It gives, instead of a snapshot in time like a drug test, it really gives you a good view of what the person's been doing, particularly for the past, 7 to sometimes 10 years. Often records go back farther than that, but typically there's a statute of limitations state by state. we're going to go through some examples. I'm going to tell you a story about a child trafficker in Houston that actually came through our system that we helped the FBI catch. I've got a domestic terrorist, which you're going to see the criminal record for here in a minute, and that was under a federal search. And then there was another story about a convicted felon. He was actually an arsonist, and the company was still happy to hire him because once they understood the backstory, they still hired him, which it's kind of a funny story. So here's just some examples of people at very high levels that have basically lied or falsified their way into positions. So Scott Thompson, who was the ex-CEO of Yahoo, in their annual report, which the CEO has to personally swear that their reports are accurate, claimed that he had a bachelor's of science in accounting and computer science, which, you know, it's helpful to have a computer science degree when you're running a tech company, but that was a total lie. He just had a degree in accounting. So anyways, some shareholders found that. Another one, Marilee Jones, she was the dean of admissions at MIT, which this is the irony of it all. She's the one that's saying whether or not people are going to get into MIT. And she actually didn't even have a college degree, even though she stated that she had multiple from prestigious institutions. So she obviously lost her job after that came to light as well. Getting into the employer liability, I'm going to try to keep an eye here on the messages as well. Employer liability, negligent hiring lawsuits are up nationwide. There's a few conferences that we go to every year, and they always have, one of the main speakers is always an industry attorney that talks a lot about the liability, not just in this industry, but really for employers. And part of what's happening is background checks as an industry is relatively young, and technology changes, and typically regulations and lawsuits and kind of everything that happens trails technology. So everybody's getting out ahead of what's happening, but now the lawsuits are catching up because people have been unscrupulous, or they've not been following the rules very well, but now there's more systems in place to catch people who are cutting corners. So the top end for negligent hiring is about $40 million. The average is 1.5 million. This is employers who don't do their due diligence. They hire somebody, and that person injures somebody, kills somebody. You know, there's lots. I mean, all you have to do is read the news, and you see a lot of the craziness that's going on, and often it's in the workplace. Employers, as a general rule, lose these cases as well. So employers, and we're going to read on the next screen, employers are liable for damages that could have been avoided if they would have used the screening sources available to them. Now, the reality is sometimes you just don't know, and there's issues, and maybe they don't have a record or they don't have a criminal record, but the information that's available that employers can easily get access to, especially in a cost-effective way, they are held liable for that. You're going to see that not all background checks are equal. In fact, they vary in quality and scope and comprehensiveness. And you've got to be working with somebody who knows what they're doing in order to make sure that you are really doing your due diligence and covering your liability as an employer. Fcra compliance is also increasing. So it's not just the negligent hiring lawsuits, but Fcra is the Fair Credit Reporting Act. That's the act that kind of sweeps in all of the background industry. So it's not just credit, it's also background checks. And so doing them right is really imperative. And people have largely relied on database searches. There are some weaknesses to database searches. The reality is databases are good. In fact, we use them all the time, but it's one of the tools in the toolbox. It's not the end-all search. And a lot of unscrupulous companies out there will sell a national search and say, hey, it's a national search, just trust us, we've got you covered. The reality is even the best national searches, and there's only a handful that we really have confidence in anyways. You know, some are good at a local or a jurisdictional level, but as a general rule, only about half of the country is going to be covered, even on the best searches on a national search. So In all reality, it's more of a multi-jurisdictional search than it is a true national search, but it is scraping information nationwide, particularly as it pertains to sex offenders and Department of Corrections. Anybody who's served time and has been in the Department of Corrections system, they will show up on a national search, but it may not show, you know, all the felonies and misdemeanors in every reporting jurisdiction in the United States, which of there's thousands. So let's see. Releases, authorizations, adverse action notices. These are all things, if you're doing backgrounds right now, you're probably familiar with those terms. You need to make sure you're getting a release to actually run a background check. You need to get the authorizations and the clearances to make sure that the companies are getting access to the data in the appropriate and the legal way. Adverse action, if you decide not to hire somebody based on finding a record on their background check, you need to send out the appropriate notices. All of these things are automated on the ARCpoint platform. So Screening Source automates all of that, which really helps, because if you're an employer that's hiring people out of state, sometimes it gets complex when you need to navigate, okay, what are the rules and regulations in this state where we're operating? Our headquarters may not be there, but we are going to have employees there. Okay, there's a question here. Does the Privacy Act also govern background checks? So pre-adverse action notices, they're asking about those as well. The Privacy Act and background checks are actually slightly different. And the FCRA governs how employers need to interact with potential applicants and employees as it pertains to their employment. Volunteers are getting lumped in there as well. Pre-adverse action, yes, we suggest using pre-adverse action, and that also is automated on the platform. Okay, so here in the yellow, these are the parts that you really want to zero in on. Every employer carries around a large invisible burden when they hire, the obligation and duty to exercise reasonable care for the safety of others. It's called due diligence. Employers must consider if a potential new employee represents a risk to others. If they fail to exercise their due diligence, a person is harmed by an employee, that employer can be sued for legal action. That's where we had that stat at the very beginning. That's the US Department of Labor. Database searches, let's get into those just a little bit to provide a little more information. Database searches, like I said, they're national, the national aggregate search where data gets pushed up from, there's felonies and there's misdemeanors, and there are many jurisdictions which will push that information upstream, and it allows a database to capture that and then to be able to report that. There are other versions of database searches as well, not all just your traditional local county prosecuted criminal search. There's federal criminal. Any instance where the FBI gets involved or gets prosecuted at a federal level, which we're gonna see one of these here in a minute, that is going to represent a federal search. Those are also a database search. They're not fully automated, but they're relatively easy to get to, and it's a very nice add-on to a package. You don't need it all the time, to be honest, but there are some circumstances where it's definitely worthwhile. The federal search, if you really look at the vast majority of crimes that are prosecuted, they're typically at the local or the jurisdictional level. You know, if somebody gets pulled over for a DUI, it's going to be dealt with typically in the county in which they were arrested and had that and where it occurred. Other forms of database searches would be identity verifications, address histories, all the identity information that gets pulled from, say, a credit header. Credit headers are a great way to get information. It's not a full credit check. You're just looking at the information that the credit reporting agencies utilize to track people. And if there's anybody who's going to care about where people are, it's going to be people who you owe money to. And so they make sure that the credit reporting agencies do a really good job tracking anywhere you've received mail, a utility bill, a cell phone bill. They actually do a really good job. If you were to pull yourself up, you'll see every address you've lived at probably for the past 20 years, sometimes more, and a lot of information there. Other ones that are automated or database searches would be like an education search. Those are actually really helpful in a lot of circumstances. You probably don't need it for all of your employees, but anybody who you're hiring that where a degree would be important, or potentially a higher level manager or executive level, you definitely want to do that. The sex offenders automated as well. There's a lot of other records that get bundled into the national search that ARCpoint provides, like Interpol, the International Most Wanted, the International Terrorist List. There's a lot of other countries that actually push a lot of their data upstream to be captured as well. Like you get a lot of information out of typically Anglo countries, like Australia reports really well. There's a lot of other countries that will push data out to make available. Court records are more at the local level. So they're prosecuted, processed, you know, wherever that crime is committed. The official record is typically housed there as well. So for example, you know, this is not, last weekend I was in Yellowstone Park with my family on vacation, and we were, you know, off on the side of the road, and there was a bear that was kind of behind some trees, and there were some other cars that were parked there, and everybody was interested in seeing this bear. And, you know, I have 2 teenage boys, and so I have one teenage boy who crawled out the window, is standing on the window and kind of up on top of the car and trying to see this bear. And we're not moving, but we're on the roadway. And a park ranger immediately flipped on his lights, pulled me over. Well, he's already pulled over, but basically stopped me and gave me a ticket for $130 because my son is standing outside of the car, typically, well, on a roadway. Anyway, so that record now is going to be stored in Yellowstone Park. They have a small little court at Mammoth in Yellowstone Park, and that record's going to be stored in Yellowstone Park. So one thing I was curious about is whether or not that ends up getting stored on the federal system, since it's a national park, or whether it's local. So I'm going to look into that just because out of just plain curiosity. Okay. So required under FCRA, database searches, if they produce a preliminary record, it's kind of like a drug test. If you run an instant test and you get a preliminarily positive on a drug test, you want to send it to the laboratory to find out, okay, let's find out the nanograms that were in the person's system. Let's find out a lot more detail. And that's the information that you take hiring action on. And it's the same thing. The FCRA outlines that if you get a preliminary hit on a database search, you have to pull the county record. The reason being is there's potentially a couple of issues. Databases are not completely flawless. They're good, but if somebody miskeyed or mistyped information in and it went into the database, it could be replicated and stored, and sometimes those are hard to purge. And so there could be potentially inaccurate information in there. There's also circumstances where there's plea in abeyance, or the person has, you know, there's been some sort of a situation where their record had an official adjustment to it. And if that were the case, or it was thrown out, or whatever happened, you would need to go and pull that county record to make sure that you have the most accurate and the most current version of whatever that criminal record was. And so that's required. There are companies out there that for years were just sending out a national preliminary search and sending that out to their client. Their client was taking action on that. And they were getting away with it for years because there weren't a lot of people paying attention. But the unscrupulous, you know, CRAs or background check companies, the liability didn't always fall onto them. Typically, it fell onto the employer, and so you want to be careful. Partially digitized and aggregated with regards to the court records, they are available often at a state level. So New York is a prime example, and I'll use this here. New York has this search called the NYOCA, NYOCA search. And basically the state of New York has decided, in order to generate revenue and in order to kind of control the flow of information out of the state, as it pertains to backgrounds, they aggregate the criminal information at a state level. And if you want that information in New York, you have to go pay them, oh, it's like $70 an hour, $70+ the NYOCA state fee. And it's just basically a revenue generator for the state of New York. Now, what stinks is everybody who wants a comprehensive search in New York needs to run that, because there are some of the local counties and jurisdictions in upstate New York that will provide information, and we can kind of circumvent the NYOCA. But if you want any information out of the boroughs in New York City, you got to get the NIOCA search, which that's really tough, especially for nonprofit organizations where they're, you know, they need to run coaches and they need to run a lot of their volunteers. It ends up being a real cost barrier. There's other state examples, for example, like Wyoming. Wyoming, like right now I'm in the state of Utah. Wyoming's our neighbor. It's funny because Utah is one of the most tech advanced states and Wyoming is one of the least tech advanced states. And so Wyoming, a lot of their information is not even available from a database standpoint. You still have to go into the county courthouse and get on a terminal and try to pull up the information on the terminal in the courthouse. And so often when records need to be pulled out of Wyoming, they're a little bit of a pain, they're slow, and there's some cost associated with that. The good thing is there's only like 500,000 or 600,000 people who live in Wyoming, and so there's not tons of volume there, but you want to keep that in mind. California is another prime example where it's a state where there's parts of the state that report very well. They push the data upstream to the nationals. Southern California, as a general rule, is better about reporting upstream. Northern California is not. Typically, you have to go to most of those jurisdictions and pull that information at a jurisdiction or a county level in order to get a 100% covered background check. One way, and so this is what gets tough because for clients say, okay, well, I want to do a comprehensive background check, but if this person's lived in 10 counties around the United States and only half of those counties are covered, what do we do? Because we're going to have to run a national and maybe we need something else, and then we're going to have to run 5 counties. A lot of companies just say, you know what, run every county they've lived in for the past 7 to 10 years. And we just want to make sure we have 100% coverage. And that's the best way to make sure that you do have 100% coverage. But there's a lot of companies that just say, hey, we need to know, we need to have a fixed cost. It doesn't make sense for us to have this open liability where we may only have to run 1 county or we may have to run 5 counties. And obviously the cost changes per applicant based on where they've lived. Packages are a really good way to mitigate or to manage those costs by saying, hey, we'll run the previous, and you can dictate what you want. So there's no real formula here, but you can say, I want the last 2 counties that they've lived in. I want to make sure that those counties are run. And if it's part of the national check, then you don't need to run it. If it's not part of it, then it would be run. And then you would at least have the past 2 counties they've lived in. And for the vast majority of people in the United States, 2 counties typically does the trick. People are getting more nomadic for sure. But as a general rule, the exposure, to counties is fairly limited. So we've already talked a little bit about this, but the baseline search from ARCpoint is really the best bang for the buck because you're going to get all of the identity verification, all the alias information. You're going to get a national criminal search, which gets all the reporting jurisdictions in the United States. You're also going to get all of these like sex offender and all the supplemental searches like the Interpol and International Most Wanted and all those other ones that I've talked about. That all gets bundled in. And so you get a really good preliminary view of the person. And you also get the Department of Corrections, which is, any felony that resulted in imprisonment, you're going to get that. But the downside is if you have somebody that had some sort of a plea in abeyance and went from a felony to a misdemeanor and it was a theft or it was something that you basically can't live with because you're an accounting firm or whatever, you definitely are going to need to do more of a thorough dive to make sure you get the information needed. I think we've already talked about the second bullet point. We've talked about the third. So the federal database is expanding for background checks and for drug tests. And I don't know if any of you are doing drug testing, but the Federal Register for anybody who is part of getting tested under the DOT program, the Federal Register goes live next year, at the beginning of next year, which is going to be great because we've had a lot of situations where people have tested off the charts positive for meth and they literally go across town and get hired with another trucking company. And if that company didn't do a good job with regards to screening and back checking, which sometimes they don't, that person is now behind the wheel of a huge truck and they're a meth addict and they just got a new job somewhere else. And so the drug testing national or the federal database, Federal Register is going into play, which I think is good. And that has actually impacted the background checks as well, because you do have to do some background checks for DOT. and they're doing a better job at the federal level providing more employer-friendly information and templated in a way where it's easier to use. I had a crazy meth example, but we don't have it loaded into the PowerPoint right now. Let's see. Okay, so here is a federal criminal one. And this actually just came through the other day. In fact, I think that, oh, they printed it off for me yesterday. But if you look here, this is what I love. All this information's been changed, by the way. The name's been changed, the date of birth. There's no way that you can back your way into this and find out who it is. But if you look at this, look at the count, under count offense, conspiracy to levy war against the United States. This is a real court record that came onto our system. Now, granted, the guy, you know, the disposition date was back in 2001. It looks like the file date was, you know, October of 2000. But this was right before 9/11, when there was, you know, a lot of stuff going on and a lot of issues. But conspiracy to levy war against the United States, that's pretty crazy. This person's actually out of jail now and went to get a job, and one of our clients that uses the Screening Source platform ran this and it pulled up. So kind of interesting. You're going to end up seeing interesting things that come through the system. Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions yet. So FCRA compliance is, it's really vital because there's much more monitoring of FCRA compliance, and people now are getting savvier about employers that aren't following rules, and them trying to kick up dirt or cause trouble for employers if they feel like they were dealt with unjustly. So FCRA compliance has been really baked into the platform. It automates much of the required reporting. This would be like the pre-adverse action, the adverse action notices. For example, you can pre-register somebody where you can just send them an email link. So say you have an applicant, you can just type in their email, hit send, and it'll send them a link that has all of the authorizations and the release forms that they basically click through. They say, I agree, I agree, I agree, type in my name, and then they can go in and actually input all of their personal information and then submit it to the system. Which HR managers really love that because it saves them the time of the data entry, but it still allows it to come into the system and they can verify it. Because if somebody wants to beat a background check, the best way to do it is to spell their name wrong and put the wrong date of birth in there, because then you're basically searching based on the wrong criteria. So our system still allows the HR managers to go in and look at it and say, hey, is all this good? Or, you know, is this going to work for us? And then they can allow it to go through the system and process. So we talked about the authorization documents. We've talked about some providers skimping on details, especially from a setup standpoint. When a new client sets up, we need to make sure that we get all the documentation required, because you're basically getting access to a really powerful platform that gives you access to tons of information. And from a CYA standpoint, we want to be covering, ARCpoint wants to be covering, you want to be covered, because if that person decides that they want to cause trouble, you've got all of your, everything, all the details are covered, and you know that you've done everything according to compliance. Adverse action we've talked about. So really, this is going to not only decrease your liability and automate your compliance, but it's really going to help you speed up your hiring process, because you're doing it all on one platform. Turnaround time is really good. And you're also going to have training accessible as well. So we have a wiki, which all clients using Screening Source, so all end clients can log in and see the wiki and say, okay, well, for example, you know, ARCpoint's in South Carolina, but there's franchises all over the country. And if there's a new franchise coming on in, say, Rhode Island, it's, you know, the question is, hey, what are the rules in Rhode Island? And I'm sharing my screen right now, and I've got it on a different screen, but anybody who signs up and is using the platform is going to get access to that wiki. And it outlines all of the background and drug test rules state by state, which is really helpful. So, okay, let's see here. one thing that the FCRA doesn't cover is it's not illegal actually to do a crappy background check. So if a company wants to just do the bare minimum, like say they want to just do kind of a crappy national search, but then not backfill, you can do that. Now, if you find a record, you're required under the FCRA to go and confirm it. But employers are not required to do a comprehensive search by law, but you're keeping that back door is open for potential litigation or problems if for some reason you did a bad background check, the person happened to live in a jurisdiction that didn't push the data upstream and it wasn't captured and reported, and you didn't go and run a local or a county or jurisdictional search, and that person's working at a daycare and they are a sex offender, or they are, now I take that back, a sex offender will probably come through on the national, but let's say that they have a violent offense or a weapons charge, and now they're working at a daycare. So, you know, to go back to some of our examples, you know, there's been situations where, like, here's a prime example, and I'll tell the story, and I told it at the ARCpoint conference, and I think it's worth telling because as employers, sometimes you'll get a record back and you're like, what the heck does this mean? Like, you know, so there was a company, and they're a big company, and I'm not going to say their name, but they're a big company, and they were hiring somebody to run their Southwest division out of Phoenix. And so they were recruiting this person away. I don't remember what part of the country this guy was coming from, but they, you know, they were spending all this money and they were recruiting him, and he was like the solution that they wanted. And anyway, and he was a great guy. He is a great guy. And so they basically brought him in, they, you know, got him going, and they're like, okay, well, let's run a background check on you. And so he submitted all of his information, and they ran the background check, and it came through on the platform. And on the platform, it said that he was, he had a felony arson charge. And they're thinking, felony arson? This guy is so great. How does he have a felony arson? And so they called and they said, hey, what do we do in this scenario? Because this guy we want to hire, and he has, everything's clean except this felony arson that happened like 5 or 6 years ago. And one of the people came to me and they said, what do we do? And I said, you know what, ask the guy. I mean, at this point, it's not going to hurt. Ask the guy what the story is. So they bring the guy in and they say, listen, you've got a felony arson. Like, what's going on? And he said, I know I should have told you, but here's what happened. You know, like years ago, I showed up, you know, I was coming home early from work to surprise my wife, and I got a surprise. She's there with some other dude, and she, you know, and so my world kind of blows up in front of me. And as they were fighting after, you know, he was surprised and they were having this verbal conflict, she said, and by the way, I've had this boyfriend for years, and our 2 little kids that you think are yours are actually his. So this guy's world melts down in a matter of minutes. And then she takes off with the guy, and he's just so upset. He gathers up all of her stuff, takes it out on the front lawn, pours gasoline all over it, and torches it. And so, you know, he probably burned tens of thousands of dollars worth of stuff, of her stuff. That technically is a felony arson. And so when he told them that story, they contacted us back and said, what do we do? And we went in and pulled all the court records. So we went through all the transcripts, we looked at all the court records, and he told the truth. He was telling the exact truth. And the company ended up hiring this guy anyways. And so it's kind of a long story, but it goes to show that there's some situations where it's worth just asking, you know, what's happened. And so that's one of the situations. You know what, let me, hold on. I'm gonna go back really quick and look at what I had on here. Whoops, excuse me. Oh, so the other one is we have a client that uses the platform. Sorry, I'm off track here now. Let me make sure I've got, there we go. We have a client that uses our platform, and they're an auto dealership. And, excuse me, the client has a client, and the client is an auto dealership. And the auto dealership was really pinched. It was in Houston. They were really pinched for staff. They really needed a new HR manager that was going to do a lot of the hiring. a lot of the onboarding, having access to people's private information, you know, like a position that required some trust and had some access to info. Anyways, nice Hispanic lady. She's in her 50s, probably close to 60. They hire her right away and they say, hey, you know, we need to get you started. Let's get you going, fill out your information. So she filled out all of her employment information. In the process, she signed the release documents, and she was signing everything. They then run the background check after she'd been working there. She'd already been there for a couple of days. They get around to running her background check. They run her background check. She comes back on the international most wanted list for child trafficking in the Dominican Republic. So all of a sudden the company, again, they call the client and the client calls us because they want, you know, they're like, hey, what's going on? And we said, listen, the obligation is to the client, not necessarily to the law enforcement, but see if they'll work with you, and then you can contact the FBI and you can forward the information. And so anyways, the FBI was contacted, and the FBI said, okay, well, don't do anything. Don't act weird. Don't say anything. Just have her come to work tomorrow morning like nothing's wrong, and we'll be there waiting for her. So the FBI was there before she showed up, and she showed up at work, and they snagged her. So, you know, it's kind of cool. There's stuff that comes through the platform every single day that has interesting, sometimes terrible, but often interesting backstories. And the platform is really powerful and allows, you know, as a client, allows you to get a lot of information that's not only extremely valuable in the hiring process, but as a general rule, it's the right thing to be doing. Background checks really make sense for any organization. It doesn't matter if you're a government, it doesn't matter if you're a private business, it doesn't matter if you're a large, small company, it doesn't matter if you're a volunteer organization, if you're a church, if you're a day camp, if anything, it's worthwhile doing background checks. And the good thing about backgrounds, we've tried to automate it as much as possible. So there's not a lot of like heartburn on your end as the client. We just need to get the information in, and we've given you multiple options to do that. You can have a link on your site. You can send out the email. You can have the applicant input it themselves, or sometimes HR people just do it themselves. So we're trying to make it as easy as possible. And so, okay, starting service with ARCpoint is actually pretty easy. There's a link that gets sent, and that initiates the setup documents and all the authorizations that need to be completed that grant you access to the platform. At that point, the training is very straightforward. We have online video trainings. The reality is, well, anybody who's used to working on any sort of platform online, it's pretty straightforward now. But we do try to make it, the training as accessible as possible. There's going to be some training on the ARCpoint side, and there's going to be some options available through IntelliProcessing as it pertains to the platform screening source as well. We talked about lessening the HR burden. And support and compliance, I mean, that's a big deal. You've got to have a platform that's going to support you and basically provide compliance. And if you really look around, the background screening and drug test industry, while the access to information has gotten better and better, often their track record for compliance and ease of use is actually not great. And that's what we're trying to fix with the new platform. Okay. Let's see, I'm now seeing some more questions here. Background checks versus fingerprinting. That's a really good question. And we actually have a kind of a white paper on it. So I'm going to send that over. Jamie, I'm going to send that to you and Ashley so you can share that.
Okay.
But
yeah,
we have a white paper on it. Fingerprints are not bad necessarily, but it's kind of like saying, hey, I want a very comprehensive view of this individual, where fingerprints give you a very slim view of whatever the potential issue is. So fingerprints are typically after people have already been arrested and they've gone into the Department of Corrections system. That's typically where fingerprints come in, or if there's been some sort of a federal crime. Fingerprinting is a little bit difficult because from a logistics standpoint, if you are going to have all of your applicants or your employees go in and get fingerprinted, first of all, there's not a lot of good places to go to perform the fingerprinting. There are some, and I think the ARCpoint may have some locations that have looked at it or are doing it. And fingerprinting's not bad, but it's hard to get a comprehensive view, and the logistics of it are tough. As a general rule, data and the court records are going to give you faster, cheaper, better information than a fingerprint. But there are some circumstances I think fingerprinting's okay. It's largely driven by, this industry used to be kind of dominated by private investigators. And private investigators are a little more old school than they are tech savvy. Not all, but historically that's kind of been the case. And there's been, that fingerprints have been, the life of fingerprinting has gone on for a long time. I'm trying to find a nice way to say this. They're still alive. They're still alive, but they're not as useful as good data, is what I'm trying to say. So let's see here.
Rob, will you go ahead and scroll down to the last page so that the contact information will be up as you're answering these questions?
Perfect.
And just to kind of summarize, you know, as an HR manager or anyone in the business, if you want to request a demo, you can go to our website, arcpointlabs.com/request a demo.
Yeah.
And you can find that on any of our local locations under their employer solutions. So if you're, you know, curious about the platform and everything, you can request a demo and get more information there. Or at the very least, you can contact one of your local ARCpoint Labs, and one of our experts will get back in touch with you and kind of go dive in deeper into background screening and the importance of it and the services that ARCpoint Labs have to offer for you. So again, we'll send out the recording to everybody who's on the webinar today, along with some additional information and links and even that sheet that Rob was just referring to. So that'll kind of get the information out and the links initiated to everybody for you. Good.
And so
somebody
asked, Jeff asked, who initiates the link to the locations? Jeff, are you talking about the link, the setup link? Because it would be typically ARCpoint would be sending the setup link out to the ARCpoint client.
Correct.
Now, if you're talking about, but then the client, this is kind of a multi-step option or situation here. The client can then send the link to the employee. So when you're talking about setting up your account, ARCpoint will send you that link. When it comes to running a background check, you as the client can send the link to the applicant or the employee, and then they can fill out the information there.
Yeah, I think honestly, the best thing to do is to request a demo, because once you kind of get in and see the process and how it all flows, you know, looking at it on screen, I think that would be the most beneficial thing for any of our participants that want to look for some more information. So check us out and we'll be happy to reach out to you for sure.
Yeah. Now, I went through that kind of quick and it was a really high overview. If any of you have specific questions right now, I don't know what our time's like, but if you want to type them in or ask quickly, I'm happy to address any of these right now.
Well, cool. Well, if you think of something, you know, after the webinar or think of a question later, feel free to email us at info@arcpointlabs.com, and we can answer you or connect with Rob to get his expert advice on any additional questions that may pop up after the webinar. Again, we'll send out the link probably tomorrow once I kind of get everything pulled together, and allow you to watch it again or send it to a colleague or whatever you need to do. So really appreciate all you taking your time today to listen to our webinar and thank Rob for his time as well. And again, if you have any additional questions, just email us at info@arcpointlabs.com. And y'all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Okay. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, everybody.